And so, today's topic, we're going to be talking about Stoicism and anger. We were chatting a bit before we went live. Why this topic? What's the appeal for you?
I just think it's one of the most interesting subjects. Like we were saying earlier, I specialized for many years in anxiety disorders, and anxiety and anger are kind of quite closely related in some ways. So I wanted to start researching and working on something else, and I'd always thought anger was kind of intriguing. It's quite a colorful and interesting emotion. I think I'd rather work with anger, for example, than be a bereavement counselor or something like that. And it's a problem that I had when I was a young guy. Like, I had a lot of anger and I had to kind of work on it myself a long time ago. So I think that was one of the reasons. And another reason, which we'll probably touch on, is it's one of the emotions that has the biggest impact. I mean, to massively simplify things, genocide is committed in part because of anger. Bombs are dropped, civilizations have been laid to waste, because of anger. Or a more personal level, marriages are destroyed, children are traumatized because of anger. It potentially has more of a social and interpersonal impact, and we see it all around us all the time. In some ways, another reason actually is that anger in some regards is one of the most neglected emotions. We said earlier, there's a lot more research on depression and anxiety, although we do know a lot about anger. We know far more about anger than most people realize, but it's relatively neglected. And yet it's everywhere. Where would you go to find anger, guys, if you wanted to look
At
for it?
the grocery
On,
store, driving.
on, I go and look on Twitter. It's US politics is, I think it's fair to say. I can't turn on my TV without being confronted by a lot of
Mhm.
outrage and anger and division and all that kind of stuff. And I think everybody is a bit sick of it, to be honest. I think most people think it's obviously a big problem. And do you know what people are doing about it? Every day it gets like a bigger thing. It's in your faces. What do we do about it? Make it worse. Nobody does anything
Mhm.
about it. Virtually nothing. It just gets stoked every day. Like this Charlie Kirk thing, like the way that politicians are responding to it and the way the media are responding to it is almost kind of designed just to kind of stoke more outrage and conflict and stuff like that. There's like not no hint of any real effort to kind of damp things down. So it's the complete opposite, really. And there might be political, historical reasons for why things have ended up in that mess. But that's a reason, I wanted to say as well, we were saying off air, there are some things that psychotherapy is not that great at treating. And then there's other things that it has a much higher success rate for. And anger actually has a kind of moderately high success rate, and has done really since records began of like measuring outcomes in psychotherapy. So we know quite a lot about what works and what doesn't, and it's definitely something we can help people with. So that's inspiring in a way. That's motivating and reassuring. We're not just kind of banging our heads against a wall here. Like we've known for a
Mhm.
long time, you can actually do stuff about it. Well, I'll tell you about one of one of my most favorite controversial research studies. There was a
Let's do
study done in,
let's
let's
also
do
get
it.
into let's also get into what we're talking about when we talk about anger. Like what's the Stoic
What
conception
is
of
it?
anger?
The Stoic conception of anger is surprisingly similar to the definite, like in the ancient world, they had it may come first of all, caveat. It might shock many people to realize that psychotherapy existed in the ancient world. Many people think that Sigmund Freud invented psychotherapy, which is, completely wrong on several levels. Freud himself studied psychotherapy. Psychotherapy in its modern form had been around for at least half a century before Freud even appeared on the scene. But psychotherapy existed in the ancient world. They called it therapy of the psyche. And there are many references to it. It was like a branch of philosophy. Entire books were dedicated to it. Most of them are lost, unless you count On Anger by Seneca, which could be classified as an entire book on Stoic psychotherapy for anger, basically. And we have examples of the Stoic consolation letters and Plutarch's consolation letters and stuff like that as well. But what I was going to say, in the ancient world, the Stoics were the sect of philosophers most associated with psychotherapy. They aligned themselves most with it. But all the other schools dabbled in it to some extent. And not only did they have um, psychotherapy practices, but they had a theory of psychopathology. They had a theory of cause and cure. And so the Stoics had a definition of anger, which is anger is a desire for revenge. And that definition is stunningly similar to the definition of every other school of ancient philosophy, as far as I'm aware. The Platonists have a similar definition. The Aristotelians have a pretty similar definition. Like we find it cropping up in other kind of more obscure philosophers. I think pretty much all of them shared a similar definition. And one interesting thing about that, we're kind of touching on another deeper, wider subject here, which is that some people might today think that's a surprising definition of anger. That isn't, the go-to for most people today. Although there's actually some research that's surprisingly consistent that desire for revenge is a recurring, it's qualitative research that shows it's a common theme, like in studies on the subjective experience of anger, even today. So it's kind of neglected in modern research as a component of anger. There are reasons for that. But there's a bigger point I want to make here, which is, and it's probably a good point to make at the beginning. When you start talking about anger and you start kind of challenging it and stuff like that, there's something that changes the game, which I found and other researchers have found the same experience, which is most people have a kind of dyed in the wool conception of anger and its role in psychology and its role in society. We have a folk psychology of anger, which, shock horror, might be wrong. By folk psychology, that's what philosophers and psychologists call everybody's default assumptions about how certain things work, how emotions work, how the mind works, and generally speaking, it's not great. We haven't spent a lot of time refining it. It could be said to contain certain flaws or oversimplifications or mistakes, but it's quite ingrained. So most people, in the very language that we use when we talk about anger, we have quite entrenched opinions about what it is, what function it might perform, the kind of pros and cons of it. But something that immediately challenges that people don't often think about is that cross-cultural research on the emotions tends to show that people experience anger quite differently in different cultures. Now, I mentioned that because you asked me what the Stoic definition was, and I said it might seem a little bit odd. It's a little bit slightly off in some ways to modern Americans and Brits and so on, Canadians. But that's because the ancient world would be an example of another culture where people did anger slightly differently. And what cross-cultural research does, once people start looking at it, it actually tends to introduce more cognitive flexibility, which is a good thing. So people start to think maybe all my assumptions about anger are a little bit arbitrary. Maybe anger could function differently or be viewed differently. Or maybe it could be experienced differently, because people in indigenous cultures, for example, often have a more negative view of anger, see it as more unhealthy. The Buddhists and Stoics traditionally thought all anger was unhealthy, which is quite different from the way that we view it today. And I would even go as far as to say, to shock horror, that Americans have a slightly different set of assumptions about anger than perhaps Brits and Canadians and other people in the Western world. And I think there are modern historical reasons for that, which maybe we can delve into, like in the political history of the US, that shapes certain attitudes that people have towards anger. But obviously, in Eastern cultures, there tends to be a more negative view about anger, and people experience it in a slightly different way. Um, And so it shouldn't be a surprise when we look at the ancient world to discover that they see it as from a slightly different lens. Although, like I said, there are things that we can definitely recognize. Most people might say, well, maybe desire for revenge is a kind of factor in it. I should explain one reason why that's different. There's a whole long story here, but historically, in terms of the cultural history, we tend to suppress anger a lot more perhaps than some people did in the ancient world. And particularly women, there's a huge gender difference in the way that people experience anger. Men are more likely to exhibit verbal aggression. Displays of physical aggression are relatively rare, funnily enough, in Western society. And anger, like this, is a big problem. It's too common, but it's not how people normally manifest their anger. Like what people normally do is they'll snap at people and be a bit rude to them. They'll maybe be passive aggressive, which in some ways, being passive aggressive is a more serious problem. It's the insidious face of anger. It's like, I'm not just going to snap at you and call you bad names, but, if I'm your boss at work and I have a burning resentment towards you, I might sabotage you for the next decade, of your life and, make your life hell without you even realizing it. So in some ways, passive aggressive behavior is actually more sinister and could be more damaging in certain regards. But women often, the research shows, tend to internalize their anger more than men. So they'll suppress it a bit more or they'll ruminate a little bit more. And sometimes where the desire for revenge actually comes out isn't so much challenging people to a duel, right? That tends not to happen as often these days, or running someone through with your spear, like in the Bronze Age or whatever. But people fantasize about revenge. They go, I wish I'd said this and humiliated that guy. It's often social damage to social status. I wish I'd taught that guy a lesson, taken him down a peg or two, given him a piece of my mind, or fantasizing about getting back at people in other ways. But there are different types of anger. So as we were talking, we'll maybe distinguish between a few subtypes. So desire for revenge is how the Stoics conceptualize it.
And then, so I mean, my question is, what is revenge in that case? I mean, is that just getting somebody back? Is that just hurting somebody? Is that, an eye for an eye? So that's my question is, what
Yeah,
is revenge? And then you said it's surprising. I think I'm so steeped in the Stoic way of thinking
yeah,
about it that it's like that I
yeah.
see that same definition. How do you think other people think about it today that maybe makes that definition surprising?
I think people view it less in terms of the desire for revenge, but if they kind of reflect on it, I think again partly because of the tendency to suppress like overt displays of aggression and deny it to some extent. So people, well, let's approach it this way. Maybe a good place to start is, what do people typically believe? What is the folk psychology of anger, right? So the folk psychology of anger, I love because it's kind of stupid, right? And it's kind of what everybody believes, and even like I and everybody, we all think in terms of this model because it's kind of baked into our language. It's the default view of emotions. So people tend to think of anger as if it's a kind of force or energy. Like I tend to say that most people assume a hydraulic model of emotion, like it's like water pressure building up or something like that. It's like a force that builds up within them, and they tend to compartmentalize faculties of the mind. So most people think they've got reason over here, and then they've got their desires and emotions over there. And anger is building up, and their rational mind is observing it, thinking, "Oh, like how am I going to control that?" That's why we get books on controlling anger management and stuff like that.
Mm.
So this is baked into the idea that there's a part of us kind of Platonic, influenced compartmentalizing or partitioning of the mind. So we think reason is kind of observing this feeling building up in us, and then what do we do with it? It gets vented in the form of aggression, and we kind of get it out of our system, like releasing the pressure, like letting off some steam. there's places you can go to hire a baseball bat, right? And you smash up a lot of crockery and all that. I'm sure you've seen that kind of thing. And there are whole therapies in the 60s built around that, where people would go in a parking lot with a baseball bat and hit a pillow, like, and this kind of stuff, cathartic or venting or abreactive therapy, are all the different names for it. And some people think that this buildup of energy you could also push down or kind of suppress somehow, or you could channel it into going and pumping things in the gym. Like you could go and work out and do something kind of constructive with it. And that's a very simplistic model. So a couple of problems with that view of anger are, number one, that these strategies don't actually work, right? So uh, there are many, many coping strategies or techniques, if you like, studied in the field of psychotherapy and stress management. And the one that has the most checkered history out of them all, perhaps, is venting or catharsis. And particularly in relation to anger, it's been studied over and over again. And consistently, the research tends to show that venting anger doesn't purge it out of your system, like you're letting out steam. And in some cases, it actually makes it worse, right? And so there's something deeply flawed. Like, so fundamentally, people think I've got this buildup of anger. If I could just get it off my chest, then I'd feel better. But doing that in some cases actually seems to be counterproductive. And so potentially channeling it into activity in the gym, depending what you mean by that. Like if what you mean is going to the gym and kind of ruminating about all the things that pissed you off and using that to kind of get you motivated and focused and producing more adrenaline, that might just be reinforcing your anger, unfortunately, right? So you can become more. That's why, because if catharsis worked, the movie Raging Bull would be pretty boring. What's his name? Mike Tyson would be a big cuddly bunny rabbit of a guy. Like, without, he'd be the chillest guy. He'd be like Bob Marley to talk to, right? Um, But actually, research shows that often people who engage in violent sports or kind of like violent activities often have higher baseline levels of anger and aggression. Maybe some exceptions to that, like maybe some martial artists like experience it differently. Um, but venting doesn't seem to work that well as a way of coping with anger. So one reason for that would be that anger isn't just like a blob of energy or a force that builds up within you. It's a and reason and the emotions aren't two separate things. Like no modern neuroscience kind of views the mind in such a kind of compartmentalized and simplistic way. So the mind uh, is much more integrated than was previously assumed. And reason and emotion are very closely intertwined. And so when people get angry, as Albert Ellis, the founder of cognitive therapy, used to say, they don't just feel angry, they also think angry. Like they have angry thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes. And so when Andrew Tate, for example, or Jordan Peterson, like advise their followers to kind of channel their anger, like and going to the gym and stuff like that, what it might do is kind of burn off the adrenaline, like or distract them temporarily. At least they're doing something positive. But it does absolutely nada potentially to change the underlying beliefs, attitudes, and values that made them susceptible to losing their temper in the first place. So if you have a sense of entitlement, for example, and you ask a girl out on a date, to take John Peterson's example, and she rejects you, right? Then going to the gym and venting that anger, channeling it into something constructive is going to not really do anything to change your sense of entitlement. Like, it's not going to prevent you from getting angry again when the same thing happens in the future. It would be better, like, to think of anger not just as this kind of welling up of energy, but to think of it more in terms, more holistic terms, and particularly in terms of the underlying attitudes and beliefs that made you angry.
Yeah, I think this is related to one of the misconceptions people have about Stoicism, many Stoics perhaps as well, where they see this division between reason and emotion and think, oh, what's Stoicism about? It's about prioritizing reason, that aspect of yourself. over.
And that leads them to think it's kind of about suppressing emotions or eliminating them or something like that. But the Stoics, that's because the Platonic theory of the mind, which carves it into three parts, in a sense was so influential. Freud, in a way, resurrected a model that was kind of influenced by that. But this idea that the mind can be divided into faculties or parts was rejected by the Stoics. It was fundamental to their opposition to the Platonic school of philosophy. And it's also, after Freud, first of all, a lot of Freud's own followers started to question his theory of mind. They thought it was compartmentalizing things and fragmenting the mind too much. So even many of the psychoanalytic theorists started to question this. And then you have the Gestalt psychotherapists who completely rejected that and, really focused on introducing a much more holistic model of the mind, and the phenomenologists and existential theorists in psychology that thought it was really important to introduce this more kind of unified, holistic understanding of the mind. There are many problems with viewing the mind in this way, but it kind of creates this weird situation where people think of reason as being struggling against this other part of them, like where the anger is, rather than thinking, as Ellis said, maybe your anger has to do with the way that you're reasoning and the beliefs that you've got and your style of thinking. You're doing angry thinking, you have angry beliefs, right? If you think anger is like this feeling that wells up over there, you're completely ignoring that fact. You have a blind spot for it. And it creates this illusion that people feel like they're observing their anger from a kind of distance in a way. And they're kind of Plato compared it to a charioteer controlling two horses, right? So the charioteer's like completely rational, and the horses are kind of wild, and he's trying to keep control over them. And so people think of anger management, or emotional self-regulation, and so on. And that way, that's the model that they use. But actually, the Stoics would say the charioteer is angry. Anger pervades your entire psyche. It's a whole way of being in the world. The Stoic passions aren't things that happen in a corner of the mind. They're states of being. They're states of the mind as a whole. And that means, they corrupt our ability to reason. We're not thinking clearly when we're angry. And that's actually at the root of many of the practical problems and misunderstandings that people are wrestling with, because they think they are thinking clearly, and they tend to underestimate the extent to which anger is clouding their judgment and biasing their thinking.
Well, so what that all makes a lot of sense to me, and I agree. So somebody that's angry is not just somebody who's doing a poor job managing it, or not somebody who has a stronger, irrational part of the soul, and somebody else. There's somebody who thinks differently.
Yeah.
What are the angry thoughts, or what are the angry ways of thinking? I'm assuming when you're doing
I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, when you're doing therapy, you're trying to intervene on those patterns.
Yeah.
So what are those patterns?
What are they? That's a really good question, right? Because people could be looking out for them a little bit. So you could call it, I think of it as the cognitive architecture of anger, basically. So there's more than one thing. And actually, I'll give a bit of a shout out to the Stoics, because let's do a little bit of a deep dive. There's kind of two stages to this answer. The Stoics and other ancient philosophers said that anger is a desire for revenge. Now that implies that it's a response to something, right? Which is, again, not quite how people tend to conceptualize it today. And the Stoics are pretty clear that it's a response to a perceived injury. And typically, Seneca says it's an injury to your perceived social status. So you feel like someone's putting you down or disrespecting you in most cases, although there are other types of anger, right? So that suggests there's actually two emotions. There's an initial feeling of getting hurt in the feels, or getting anxious, or feeling ashamed. There's a not nice feeling. And then anger is a secondary emotion that in some ways, shock horror, might actually be more like a coping strategy than a primary emotion. And so actually many clinicians would say it's quite useful, to rip up another part of the way that we normally think of anger, and start to think of anger less as an emotion, more as a coping strategy. It's a way
Mhm.
of dealing with the preceding emotion. That's actually one of the most fruitful. I'll give you a little anecdote about that. Aaron T. Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, said that in virtually every client that he worked with, he got to monitor. He said most of them, a lot of them at first said that they weren't aware of their anger being a response to a preceding emotion. But Beck used to train people to scrutinize their experience and record it meticulously, observing, looking out for the initial automatic thoughts that preceded the emotion. And he said when he did that, virtually all of his clients reported back that they noticed there was a preceding emotion that anger was responding to. Now, I'll be blunt about it. Okay, but I'll give you a kind of bit of a spoiler, I suppose. You could say, well, what sort of emotional coping strategy is anger? Well, it's a fairly safe bet that it's a form of avoidance, right? So you could also conceptualize anger very simplistically, kind of like a distraction technique in a way. Like it's a way that we distract ourselves and avoid experiencing an initial painful emotion in many cases. And the ancient Stoics were seem to be very aware of that. It's a desire for revenge in response to an initial sense of injury, as they describe it. And Marcus Aurelius says when he's talking about anger, if you removed the initial injury, then the anger would go away. Now that's interesting because now he's thinking about which cognitions are upstream and which ones are downstream. You know, he's thinking more strategically like a clinician might today.
Yeah, so there's this idea of um, you've been harmed, but the difference between an angry person and not angry person is maybe that Marcus Aurelius put
Yeah.
is like the amount of harm you perceive.
Well,
If someone who's
yeah,
constantly seeing themselves as being harmed is probably going to have more reasons to be angry. And then another point then is how you respond to that harm.
yeah,
So, do you require revenge? Do you attribute it to, well, that person deserves to be punished for what they did,
yes.
instead of maybe some other way of thinking about it, right?
Well, I'll flesh out the model a little. I'll try and be brief because there's a few other bits. So what we could say is in anger, one way of conceptualizing it is, in fact, that it begins with a rigid demand or a goal. This is like based on standard models of cognitive appraisal, models of stress, and so on, right? So we could say what's actually in the background is I demand respect from other people. I expect to get my way. I expect my kids to listen to me or my wife to understand me. And that expectation is not just like something that I prefer, it's a demand. It's quite rigid, right? And absolute. So that sets the stage for anger. And that's why anger has always been quite closely linked to the concept of frustration, right? So rigid demands are a recipe for neurosis. They are bound to be frustrated at some point. And that frustration is kind of often seen as the germ of anger. So I demand that other people are polite to me. Like I damn well expect that my relatives all send me a birthday card every year. Now, at some point, they're bound not to do it. In which case, I'm going to be hurt, right? I'll be offended. You could say I'm catastrophizing now the fact that my demand wasn't met. Now, at this point, I might feel sad or anxious or shame or something, depending on the circumstances. It might be there's a kind of amplifier, which might be that if I perceive what someone did is morally unjust, like that's a common theme in anger, right? But it seems to be play the role of amplifying, rather than just being a personal offense. If I think what you did was you lied to me, you deceived me, you're a rotten crook, it's what you did was fundamentally unjust. That seems to now amplify me and push me more in the direction of anger. But at this point, I might just kind of feel anxious or hurt or something like that. So what the transition point, I think, comes with attributing blame to the other person and perceiving them as the source of the problem, which radically shifts the way that I'm experiencing my emotion. And then that is often connected with what's sometimes called a global negative rating. I like to call it vilification. Right. So you kind of touched on that before. I might say it's all your fault, actually. Right. And then I might say, because you're a jerk, you're an idiot, like you're a rotten person, right? And so psychologists are very interested in this idea that you would pigeonhole somebody and attach a label to them, and that's obviously something that people tend to do when they're angry. Some people think it's quite integral to anger, and then actually the desire for revenge usually happens kind of last in a way. Like it kind of comes downstream. So the ancients said it's really the desire for revenge that's definitive of anger. Other people have said it's more the vilification that they think of as being integral to it. Probably some combination thereof. Like there's a few ingredients kind of interacting with each other. But typically, if not always, the kind of origin of it is in a preceding emotion of hurt or shame or anxiety, and then the desire to kind of make the other person suffer or get back at them somehow, like the lex talionis, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's quite a primitive way of thinking. But the Stoics would say, the sage wouldn't have perceived himself as being hurt in the first place. Like Diogenes the Cynic, sticks and stones can hurt my bones, but words, will never harm me, kind of thing. It's like water off a duck's back to the sage if somebody doesn't send him a birthday card, right? So he has nothing to get angry about in the first place, let alone, escalating it with these other irrational beliefs.
Yeah, I think about Marcus Aurelius. I think it's 2.1 where he talks about when you wake up in the morning, remind yourself of the kind of people you'll encounter, and that they'll be busybody and selfish, and they'll have these issues. And that's kind. I feel like that's kind of trying to break down the rigid beliefs, maybe of don't expect people to treat you a certain way just because you're emperor. And then at the end, he's like,
Yeah.
remember that they're this way because they don't know, good from
Well,
evil.
yeah. There's two things there. Let's conceptualize it a little bit, okay? So what he's doing is you could say him in part as challenging the rigid demand. So the rigid demand is, in a sense, I expect everyone to be perfect and up to my high standard. And he's doing the opposite there. What the Stoics often do is emphasize the fallibility of other people. They say, I don't expect other people to be perfect. I don't expect everybody to be wise. I don't expect everybody to be kind and considerate towards me. That's not realistic. So in doing that, he's adopting a more flexible and more adaptive way of thinking, and he's really undermining this rigidity. The opposite would be I get up in the morning, I expect all these German envoys, and all these senators from Rome to be really polite to me and to be honest with me. And if they're not, that's just unbearable, and it means they're complete jerks. That would be the opposite of what he's doing. And then the other thing he's doing that ties in a bit, but I guess we could phrase it in a slightly different way. Like you said, he's saying, they don't understand the nature of the good, so that because they're unwise, right? So like Socrates said, no man does evil knowingly, and therefore no man does evil willingly. So Marcus is countering what we call hostile attribution bias there. Like people that are prone to anger, well, if somebody doesn't send them say why, like if you didn't say, Michael, if you didn't send me a Christmas card or a birthday card, what could be the reason for that?
I could have forgotten.
Maybe you
Something
just
else could have
forgot.
been, yeah,
Yeah,
something else
maybe
going
you
on.
didn't realize how important it is to me, right?
Mhm.
Or something like that. Or maybe I come to think of it, I didn't send you one, right? But if I'm angry, I have a cognitive bias potentially called hostile attribution bias that makes me primed and more likely to think you did it to try and hurt me. Like you did it out of malice. Like you did it because you're a jerk. That's why you did it, right? So I'll tend to attribute to malicious intent on your part. And Marcus is countering that directly by saying, these people are not perfect. They're not wise. So I shouldn't expect them to completely understand the implications of everything they're doing. They're not doing it out of evil or malice. You know, well, the Stoics generally are more likely to interpret other people's vicious behavior or offending behavior to attribute it to ignorance. rather than to malice. Which that's one way of dealing with it, and that definitely tends to diffuse anger. Um, you know, it really integral to a lot of anger is blaming other people and viewing their actions as the result of deliberate malice.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense to me. And then I was going to push it even further, at a risk of I don't want to say, oh, you've got this framework and Marcus is doing this exact thing, but it also seemed he also has that line about we're all part of the same, I'm paraphrasing, but we're all part of the same family. Like we're all humans, we're all connected by reason. And that could be this like
Mm.
desire, attack the desire for revenge as well, right? Like why would I want to attack a
Yeah,
part of myself? Why would I want to attack a part of my family? There's at least parts of each of those. I've never thought about, and I wrote
yeah,
that down, like less rigid beliefs, less attribution of blame, less desire for
yeah.
revenge. Seems like he's hitting all of those.
He has. There's another passage. 2.1 is very important, but there's another passage that's very explicitly about anger, and it's 11:18, and he lists 10 separate cognitive strategies for coping with anger, and it's remarkable. I've talked about it a lot, so I'm not going to talk about it as much today. But in those 10 strategies, you can potentially see him as targeting most of the, or perhaps all of the different cognitive components of anger. The Stoics also use behavioral techniques to deal with anger, like postponement and stuff like that. But here he's only talking about the cognitive side of Stoicism, and he's got 10 strategies. That's a lot, right? Actually, one thing I'll say about that is I'll make a speculation that might surprise people. I'll stick my neck out, right? I taught psychotherapists for many years. I often say if I stood up and because this is exactly what I would do, I would stand up in front of the class with a whiteboard and I'd say, okay, guys, how many cognitive techniques can you think of for dealing with anger? And we'll write them on the flip chart, right? And I think in a room full of like 30 people, clinical psychologists and therapists and stuff, they'd maybe come up with four or five, unless we wanted to stand around all day, you know. I think they definitely wouldn't come up with 10. I'd be kind of amazed if they actually come up with 10. They'd come up with different versions of the same thing, but I don't think they'd come up with 10. He has 10 distinct strategies that clearly say distinct things, right? Now, the odd thing I'll say about that is I that really puzzled me, and I thought, what kind of guy would be able to do that, right? Something doesn't kind of quite gel about this, and I thought somebody who can classify a range of techniques like that, I'd expect that to be a researcher or a professional teacher, like some kind of academic expert, like on the subject. Marcus Aurelius was not. Right. So normally, if you've got anger problems and I give you an anger management book and it's got 10 techniques in it, do you know what you're probably going to do? You're going to probably pick the two or three that you like the best and that work for you, and you'll use those and forget about the rest. Right. That's normally what people do. Like you wouldn't expect people to use all 10 of them. And not only does he list 10, he keeps returning to selections from the list throughout the rest of the meditations. Like he genuinely really understands all 10 of these techniques. So Marcus Aurelius, it seems to me, has this kind of professional level of understanding that's quite remarkable of the range of therapeutic techniques. That's genuinely surprising to me. And the only way that I can explain it is that I think he probably knew somebody who is like an expert on Stoic psychotherapy, And if I had to guess, I'd say maybe it was Junius Rusticus, or somebody that he was really close to and spent a lot of time with, that actually maybe had written a book about the subject and lectured on it and studied it systematically, because he didn't develop that level of understanding by chance. I can promise you that. Like you don't get that. You're people that are listening to this video, many of them will have bookshelves full of self-help books, right? And they've probably gone on lots of workshops and stuff. But if I asked them to give me a range of 10 different cognitive strategies for coping with anger, I think they would struggle, right? In my experience. So he has a level of understanding that's really quite remarkable. And it touches on most of these different cognitive components of the problem.
So is there something else? Well, what are kind of key lessons from Marcus? So we've established, he's an expert on this or has this really impressive understanding. What are there some, you could pinpoint some insights that he shares that you think are really valuable or maybe neglected today?
There are some things that are quite hard to understand but I think he's onto something. Um, and then there are other things that are more obviously related to the way that we would approach the subject today. For example, let's see, he a big part of it, like Marcus obviously says, when you're angry, tell yourself it's not the other person's behavior that offends you, but your opinion about it. So he just paraphrases Epictetus, right? So we call this verbal diffusion or cognitive distancing. There's lots of different names for it in psychology. But this ability to shift your focus onto your own mental activity and become self-aware of how you're generating your anger through your opinions is very robust. We know from many research studies that this is a very flexible and robust way of dealing with emotions, including anger. Other things he does that are less well known are he does a big component of anger is we said earlier that anger is a state of thinking as well as feeling. So one of the cognitive biases is that we know that angry people have impaired, generally speaking, they have impaired problem solving and decision making ability. And the obvious reason for that is that they tend to not be very good at evaluating the consequences of their actions. So the clue is angry people often do stuff and then regret it afterwards when they've calmed down. And they maybe feel ashamed of their actions afterwards or whatever, because their brain's ability to evaluate the wider impact and longer term consequences of their actions, and also their ability to empathize with other people. So to imagine how their behavior appears to other people is all inhibited like by the state of mind that they're in. So those are all like, it's a mixture of the emotion and also cognitive biases that become activated. So Marcus says to himself, what does you more harm, your anger or the thing that you're angry about? Which is a kind of a way of addressing that. Basically, it's also a way of shifting the focus of attention more internally. Like one of the key, I said earlier, anger could be viewed. We could talk a lot about how anger functions as an emotional coping strategy, but I said it was a kind of distraction technique. So the big thing that shifts with anger, the obvious difference, is that there's a dramatic change in your focus of attention. So when you get angry, you tend to focus much more on the other person and your focus becomes narrow, so you're not thinking about the wider situation, the context, and so on. You're thinking in more immediate terms usually. um, so anything that heightens self-awareness and turns your attention back inwards is inherently antagonistic to anger. Angry people are not self-aware, generally speaking, right? In the ancient world, sometimes they would talk about the idea of holding up a mirror to somebody who was angry. Seneca does that verbally. He goes into great detail describing the face of angry people and what they look like to try and heighten self-consciousness, right? So what does you more harm, your anger or the thing that you're angry about? That question forces you to reflect not only on the thing you're angry about, but also to compare that to what's going on inside you. So it forces you to turn your attention back inwards, right? The very fact that you're asking that question is disruptive to this psychological sequence that constitutes anger, basically. So it's a very powerful, subtle question. And also there's an element of functional analysis to it. So you might go, okay, yeah, I'm starting to think more about consequences. Marcus elsewhere in the Meditations says when you're getting angry, you should ask yourself, will I regret this later? Which seems like just a quaint thing to say. But again, that's forcing him to use his prefrontal cortex and to engage more in consequential thinking, if you want to put it in a slightly more technical term. And that's contrary to what's normally going on in anger. Basically, that's inhibited or turned off normally in anger, right? But smartly, like therapists will often get the clients to do a kind of cost benefit analysis of anger and weigh up the pros and cons of it, which you can do in a therapy session. But when the red mist descends and somebody's losing their temper, they're not going to say, hang on a minute, well, I just get my flip chart out and I weigh up the pros and cons of punching this guy in the face. Like, and I'll try and evaluate whether it's a net negative or a net positive. You haven't got the bandwidth to do that, right? And Marcus seems to realize that. So his kind of functional analysis type questions, getting his techniques for thinking about the consequences are very concise. He just says, "Will I regret this later? Is the anger doing me more harm than the thing I'm angry about?" It's like one sentence, like a coping statement, right? Which, like again, like it's almost like he knows what he's talking about. Like, I mean, I read a lot of books by people, psychotherapists and self-help books, and I think it kind of sounds, if I read between the lines, like this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, right? But honestly, right, there are a lot of self-help books, and you think, has this guy ever tried this? Like, I hate to pick on Jordan Peterson all the time, but I kind of think some of Jordan Peterson's advice, I sort of think, has this guy ever been in a fight? Like, does he actually understand? Like, about you should stand up straight like a lobster or something and make eye contact with everybody in order to project confidence, right? Well, when I worked in schools in South London, if I told the 15-year-olds, kids that I was working with to do that, I think they would just immediately be like, well, I'm going to get my head kicked in if I do that, right? Like, there's a time and a place for that. Sometimes you're probably better off to keep your head down because you don't want to provoke people by making eye contact with them round about these streets. Um, so I think this doesn't really sound like it's been tested out in practice that thoroughly, right? But with Marcus Aurelius, and I'll give you another one, by the way, Stephen Covey. I'm not super into kind of management stuff, but when I read Stephen Covey's book, was 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, I thought, I can tell that this guy's actually been putting this into practice for a long time and he's smoothed off the rough edges from it. It's very coherent. It's quite simple. Like, it's kind of similar to Stoicism in some ways, But I think people actually underappreciate that old self-help book. But Marcus has that feel of like he genuinely knows what he's talking about. He's put these ideas into practice, right? Like they're like they pass the smell test, right?
Yeah, I remember. I actually think it was in the 7 Habits for Highly Effective Teens. I think that's the actual one I read way back in the day. And there was a story in that book about it, the value of a paradigm shift when you were getting angry with somebody, and it was this kind of anecdote of like you have these cookies and someone stealing your cookies, and you get all mad at them, and then after they leave, you realize that that was their cookies, and you were actually like taking some of theirs by accident.
Yeah,
It's this kind of, I think about that now as like, oh, that was like one of my first exposures to the Stoic idea of like, the cognitive component of
yeah.
anger and this kind of paradigm shift.
That,
I
you've given a really good illustration of the cognitive model of emotion. Like, there's another one that I think Beck gives, which is he says, for example, imagine you wake up in the middle of the night and you're alone in the house and you hear footsteps and you think, oh my God, there's like a burglar
Huh.
in the house. Like, and so you're terrified, and then you creep out into the hallway and you realize it's the cat or something, right? And then of course your anxiety is gonna it won't disappear immediately, but it'll go away pretty quickly. Why did it go away? Because you went to the gym and channeled it and pumping things or whatever? No, like because you vented it or something? Because you suppressed it? No, because your cognition's changed, right? Like
Yeah.
your anxious thinking, your catastrophic thinking went poof because you realize it was just a big mistake. Like, and then the anxiety it might take a little while for your heart rate to go back down, but your anxiety is basically going to go away unless you start worrying about something else. So that I think that's a very important example. Um,
Yeah. Donald, I feel like we could talk about this for much longer than the time we have set aside, but I would be remiss if I didn't bring up, I mean, what I think is one of the
yeah.
most challenging questions, and one the Stoics
Okay.
care about and take a hard line on. Is there
Yeah.
is there ever a time when there's healthy anger?
This is my
And
favorite question.
yeah.
All right. So I've got enough intellectual humility to say that I don't know for sure, right? And I think that um, it partly depends on how you define anger. So part of the problem is that I said earlier, there's different types of anger. It's a little bit of a fuzzy cultural constructed concept. It's different in different societies. So people may have slightly different definitions of it, right? What you call frustration, I might call anger, and so on, right? Um, But I generally lean towards the Stoic and Buddhist view, like, or traditionally the Buddhist view, which is that basically all anger is kind of unnecessary and pointless, which might surprise a lot of people. I think the I could talk for hours and hours about this, right? But the benefits that people attribute to anger are usually there's only a few. Like it motivates them to fight injustice is probably the main one. Or the other one that you get from therapists is it somehow it's like a message, like tells you something,
Hmm.
like that someone's mistreating you or something like that. I could talk all day about this, but I think both of those perceived benefits are flawed interpretations. And also, what they ignore, and this is so weird. Like I've read some books by quite famous academics, very highly regarded academics, discussing anger. And the way that they evaluate it is they talk about the benefits and they don't do a cost benefit analysis. You think, hang on a minute, buddy. If you're going to list the benefits of something, you have to list the costs as well. And then what matters would be whether it's a net, like not the gross benefits, but the net benefits once you've deducted the costs from it, right? So it might be that anger motivates you, but if it also gives you a coronary heart attack, then the net benefit might suck, right? And you'd be better off doing something else instead. Okay. So you have to kind of look at it in a slightly more rounded way. But I would say even the perceived benefits are inherently flawed. So a couple of things about it. Like I'll do this really fast, right? So the idea that it sends you a message. No, what you get from anger is more like propaganda than a message, right? It's a distorted message, right? So you can extract information from it, but you can't usually take it at face value. And also, like I said, anger typically is a secondary emotion. So it's a Johnny come lately on the scene if you actually observe it closely. What the message is coming from is the initial threat appraisal that preceded the anger. And actually, the anger is masking that, like, and clouding the issue, right? So it's the thing that came before the anger, if anything, that has got a slightly less corrupted message in it that you might want to look at. And that same objection actually applies to the thing about motivation. So there's two things I'd say about motivation. Anger basically causes you to release adrenaline, right? And that'll motivate you for like 20 or 30 minutes, right? And then your body starts to produce cortisol, and then you get the crappy effects of like longer term stress, right? And you can kind of try keeping doing that. So it's like you keep like pumping out more adrenaline, but you get diminishing returns from it, and it has some quite negative like health effects over the long term. There's a well established correlation between cardiovascular disease, very robust correlation between cardiovascular disease and anger, mainly because anger increases your blood pressure more than any other emotion. And that's partly because it increases your muscular tension more than any other emotion. But the idea that it motivates you, so let's say it produces adrenaline, right? It's not the anger that produces the adrenaline anyway, it's the initial threat appraisal. Like, it's the fear that motivates you, usually, like when you're angry, and then the anger comes on top of that. But you already had adrenaline, like as soon as somebody insulted you or whatever, and you got your heart rate started to accelerate and your adrenal glands were stimulated. So it wasn't actually necessarily the anger that triggered that. It's probably the emotion that preceded it. But also, I call this is my final rejoinder to that for now. There's a meme on the internet that says, drink coffee, do stupid things faster and with more energy. That's what I think this argument about anger motivating you sounds like to me. Because the costs of anger are that it dramatically impairs your decision making, problem solving. It tends to lead to crappy decisions in general. So it gives me some motivation, but it makes me crap at decision making and makes me do stupid things, right? So to me, you might say, well, those disadvantages outweigh the benefits of the motivation. Not only that, it's a particularly toxic combination. So to be highly motivated but stupider sounds like a recipe for disaster to me. Yeah. Like it sounds like you probably want to be less motivated and sit down and be quiet for a minute, like until you've calmed down and you're no longer thinking about things in such rigid black and white and kind of catastrophic terms in many cases. You might want to take a time out instead of having an adrenaline rush and rushing into action when you're not thinking straight. Angry people tend to underestimate risk, right? Which makes them dangerous to be around, you may have noticed. Like, it's well documented that angry people are reckless and impulsive because they underestimate risk, right? So they expose themselves and other people around them to more danger, right? They'll get you killed, like in some situations. So we don't want them. It's anger almost is like doing a line of cocaine, right? Why would you want to, in that situation, give somebody an energy boost and make them more motivated on doing stuff that they're probably going to regret afterwards? That I think is part of the problem with the perceived benefit of motivation. The other thing is that people say it concentrates the mind and focuses attention. That's awesome. But the flip side of that is selective thinking. So what you're actually describing is the fact that you're not using your prefrontal cortex properly and evaluating the context and the consequences of your action. You're just kind of like thinking about the immediate situation. That feels great, but that's a recipe for making stupid decisions again. So those are some of the things that I'm being a bit glib, but those are some of the things I think people need to think through. That might be the downside of anger.
Well, one of my big takeaways from this conversation is that differentiation between the threat appraisal, the initial harm, and then anger as a response to it, because the typical counterpoint is that there's something kind of unethical about seeing political injustice. There's something unethical
Yeah,
about, somebody insults or harms your family member and you're not angry. It's like you're kind of failing in your role as
yeah,
a parent or a sibling but I think there's this way to break this apart where it's like you can evaluate a harm. I mean,
yeah,
the Stoics have lots of arguments about if that's a harm. It depends on how Stoic you are, but you can evaluate that harm, and then the piece of like, well, that person deserved revenge, but I'm going to now, address this in an angry way, almost becomes an
yeah.
entirely separate
I'm
piece.
going to make things worse. Like,
Yeah.
angry people specialize in making problems worse. Is how I would put it. Right? They're real experts at making things worse. I don't know if people have noticed that. Right. So this is partly what you're alluding to here. In part, is this American thing that I think stems from this history of the civil rights movement and the idea that being angry and protesting about stuff is a way to fight injustice. Now, when I mentioned cross-cultural psychology earlier, I think part of it is that that's quite an entrenched view in American culture, but it's not a view that's as common in other countries. So in Northern Ireland, for example, it would seem weird to say we should get really angry with the Catholics and really angry with the Protestants and protest aggressively what they're doing. Because everyone would think, no, 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 everyone needs to kind of like chill out, and be more calm. That's the only way we're going to resolve the conflict. In South Africa, Nelson Mandela said we need to leave our anger behind us, like in order to understand the oppressor. Because if we view them as our enemy and we have a desire for revenge, we're never going to like live in peace. Gandhi said we're never going to be able to free India from colonialism as long as we are aggressive and get angry and see the Raj, like the Brits, as our enemy. Like, but in America, it was different. Like, and people embraced anger more on this model of it being a motivating tool to express disagreement with injustice. And where did that get us? Right. So one of the problems with that, I think we see played out all over the internet today, right? I'll mention one other psychological fact, a social psychological observation about the nature of anger and the way that it affects politics, right? If someone is really angry and they're like thumping the table and other people are listening to what they're saying, if you guys agree with me and I'm like getting really angry and worked up about something, and I'm like, this is terrible, it's an injustice, these guys are idiots, we have to do something about it. And you're like, yeah, you're right, Donald, like we're all on board with this. So if I ask you to evaluate my anger, you're going to say it's a marker of passion and integrity, and it'll increase my credibility in your eyes, right? But if you
Mhm.
guys disagree with my values and have an opposing view, and I get really angry and start tub thumping and stuff, there's a bimodal effect, right? It splits into two extremes. So you're more likely to think you just sound crazy. and irrational, and my credibility as a speaker will nosedive in your eyes. And I think that's American politics in a nutshell. Like, and I think one of the best examples of it actually on the internet is not an American. It's probably Greta Thunberg, right? Because the people that agree with her love it when she gets really angry and worked up about stuff because they think it just shows that she's passionate and has integrity and her credibility goes up in their eyes. But then the people that can't stand her and are skeptics about climate change and stuff like that love nothing more than posting pictures of her looking angry on the internet. And what do they say? It means that she's hysterical and irrational, and therefore she has zero credibility in their eyes, right? So the danger is that people in politics use anger because it raises their value among their in-group, right? So
Hmm.
among other Democrats or other Republicans or whatever, but it creates much more division,
Yeah.
basically, and it alienates people that don't share your values. And it really, in other words, it's the opposite of Socratic dialogue, right? It prevents you. Do you know what Epictetus said to his students was the most valuable thing they could learn from Socrates? Epictetus loved Socrates. You know, he goes on about him all the time. He tells his students that repeatedly that that's their supreme role model, even above Zeno or Diogenes, Socrates. They should be emulating. He says, you know, the foremost thing that you could learn about him is how to get in a conversation with people without it degenerating into a squabble. That's what he thinks. The main thing they can. It's not like Plato's theory of forms, like or the definition of justice. It's like how to have a civil conversation with people without it degenerating. But anger clearly leads to this bimodal effect, which shatters that like and base completely undermines the possibility of it happening. So I think it's a shame that this view became entrenched in American culture. The anger plays a positive role in protesting against social injustice because it's a big blind spot and it obscures the fact that in many ways it can actually backfire, particularly over the longer time, where people that don't agree with you will start to discount you. Like the Black Lives Matter movement, I mean, again, the people that oppose that, the angrier the protests are, the more people just dismiss it as crazy and irrational, right? You know, clearly. I mean, it's funny because, like in Northern Ireland or, you know, in other countries around the world, people would think, obviously, like, you know, but for some reason, America's kind of fallen into this trap.
Yeah. Well,
Like,
it has
you
a
know,
ratcheting type effect, really, where it's almost rational. Where if I see someone who's angry about a cause I agree with, that's evidence that they genuinely do care about that cause. And now that
yeah.
this has become culturally standard, if I see
And it
someone who's
really,
not angry at this, then that
they
is
should be
evidence that they don't
angry.
agree with me. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I think to the extent that one can, it would be an excellent cycle to break. But it's certainly,
I'll add one more thing about this, right? Which I don't really have time to go into, but this is something that I would speak to a lot of my clients about, right? The fundamental disputation isn't that the costs outweigh the benefits. It's that the perceived benefits are actually paradoxically, ironically, self-defeating, right? In most cases, when you're disputing a belief in cognitive therapy. So people think that anger is a good way of fighting injustice, but it might be actually it's backfiring in many cases and making the problem. It wouldn't be shocking. I mean, again, we'd have to dissect the culture a little bit, but I mean, it's an obvious thing to say that in many cases, anger and aggression just lead to cycles of violence, like, and create more social division. That would be a particularly controversial thing to say. So in many cases, I think people achieve the opposite of what they're hoping to achieve by becoming really angry and worked up about things. I think the right in America love nothing more than when people on the left riot. Yeah. And likewise, you know, people on the left in America love nothing more like than when people on the right get really angry and irate and stuff because they think it's validating and it allows them to completely dismiss the perspective and there's no middle ground anymore. Like, you know, everybody's driven towards like quite extreme positions. So yeah, I think like the realizing that in the long run it's probably not really going to get you what you want. The other thing I mentioned, you mentioned some other examples. I was just going to touch on them very briefly. Like, so I think there were things, slightly different examples, like, for example, protecting your family if somebody attacks them or something like that. Um, so that fundamental distinction that we have to make, maybe I should have made this earlier, is between aggression and anger, right? So usually when we talk about aggression, we're talking about the behavior. And when we talk about anger, we're talking about the emotion. And people typically confuse them and equate them, right? But the irony is that aggressive behavior, in many cases, naturally is not accompanied by anger. So the paradigmatic example of that would be what's called predatory aggression in animals. And we have a clear example of that in the human species, as well as in animals, when people go deer hunting, like, or do engage in other forms of hunting. So if you get like really, really angry when you try to shoot a deer, like, it's not going to help you at all. It would seem ridiculous, right? So to be like a really good hunter, you probably want to be completely calm and unemotional, like, and just focus on what you're doing. And that's the same even in the animal kingdom. Predatory aggression isn't usually accompanied by anger, because anger makes you reckless, impulsive. It clouds your judgment. Like, you need to be really focused and rational, like, and see things clearly, like a sniper, in the military or something like that, if you're going to use aggression effectively. I mean, I think it would be the same in martial arts and wrestling and things like that, right? Like the example the easy example is Muhammad Ali fighting George Foreman. I said, how am I going to beat this guy? I'll make him angry, right? Provoke him. And George Foreman, threw too many punches and exhausted himself in the first few rounds. And Muhammad Ali beat him, like, partly because he provoked him and made him lose his temper. So aggression, like, often makes people do stupid things. Like, if, for example, it might make somebody who's in a fight drop their guard because you underestimate risk and your focus is more just on attacking the other people. But I'll say one other thing about aggression and about anger to leave you with, right? If you actually look at the evolutionary precursors of it, our emotion of anger has less in common with defensive aggression, where you probably also want to be unemotional, like, and just really focused on getting the job done, right? Or predatory aggression. The thing that it resembles most, and for some reason people don't usually think of this as the analogy, it's more like ritualistic displays of dominance in primate society. It's when chimps start banging their chest and shrieking and stuff to assert dominance. And the difference is when a chimp is hunting a monkey, like, it's very quiet and it stays out of view, right? Doesn't want to be seen, generally speaking. But in ritualistic aggression, it's completely opposite. You want to be seen, right? And so it's more about, like, I think the evolutionary precursor of what we call anger has got far more to do with social status than it has to do with fighting and defending yourself. It's got very little to do with fighting, actually. Like, there are reasons why it lapses into desire for revenge and stuff like that. But really, it's more about getting people to submit to your authority and apologize to you, and asserting your dominance and getting them to become subordinate to you, essentially. So anger is a big display, right? And the behavior that would be useful in displaying anger and making a big show out of it is often really unhelpful in terms of dealing with a dangerous situation or hunting or something like that. Like, it's the complete opposite in a sense. I'll give you one other little analogy. In the ancient world, um, wars often were actually more about dominance. So in tribal warfare, often not that many people are killed. Like, so kind of run screaming at each other like a Highland charge, and they just want to frighten the enemy, and a few people will get injured. The people tend to slash with swords or axes, and they're keeping the other person at a distance from them by doing that. Like, and it causes superficial wounds, and maybe a couple of guys get killed, like, and then everybody goes home. Like, we haven't wiped out the entire other tribe or whatever. But sometimes it becomes more of a professional job, like in the Roman legions, where they had to train their legionaries to run people through with their swords, right, and to fight in silence, right? So what the Romans were doing was putting a lot of effort into training people to replace this natural kind of dominance behavior, which is really not conducive to being a killing machine, like, and replace it with pure aggression, behave more like hunters in a way, be very quiet and very focused and just go for the kill rather than just trying to make a big show and frighten the enemy away.
Yeah, great. That that's just left me with a lot to think about. That difference between the kind of the social component of anger, the dominance component, the display. I really like the distinction between aggression and anger. And I mean, as a lifetime practitioner of martial arts, I'm thinking about that as almost the training of aggression and not anger, if that's the distinction we want to call it, or the control of
Yeah,
aggression. Absolutely. Um, we're Donald, I really want to thank you for the conversation. I really enjoyed it. Um, and I want to thank everybody who joined to watch live as well. This was our first Substack live event, and it seemed to go well. And appreciate everybody joining. Um, Donald, any kind of last words, either on anger or on what you're working on right now that you want to share with those watching?
I think if people just want to check out my Substack, they can find a lot of articles about anger there and some podcasts. I'll tell you a couple of the podcasts that I did. I interviewed um, Ray Giuseppe, who's one of the world's leading experts on research on psychotherapy for anger. I interviewed him actually, and I talked to him about Marcus Aurelius, and we went through those 10 techniques. And I said, Ray, how did each one of these like compare to things that we would do in CBT, do you think? And we had a little bit of a conversation about that. So I'm hoping maybe one day to do like a series of podcasts where I interview a lot of famous psychologists or psychotherapists and specifically do a series talking to all of them about Stoicism and anger, maybe if I have time. But they can check that out. I'm working on a book about anger, but it won't be out for quite a long time. And I guess if there's something that I could maybe leave people with that might be relevant to this, I think it's really just the simplest advice about anger is bearing in mind that as we said, there's a few different types of anger, but the most common one, there's usually a preceding emotion. If you can notice what the preceding emotion is, and then some advice in psychotherapy is surprisingly simple and works surprisingly well. And then there's other things that are really tricky. So often just telling people, the initial feeling of kind of anxiety or hurt, just sit with it for another 5 or 10 seconds, like longer than normal, and just like pause and allow yourself to fully experience it. And for some reason, probably for multiple reasons, that tends to have quite a profound effect. Because usually, you only have to pause for 5 or 10 seconds to disrupt the anger from escalating. And usually by the time people start to think, why did that hurt me so much? Like when I asked my kids to go to bed and they ignored me or, something, well, why did I feel so frustrated about that? And naturally, if you just pause a bit, you'll begin to think, maybe there are other ways of feeling about this or other ways of responding to it. And then that's already derailed the anger. Usually you don't even get to the anger.
David,
Absolutely.
very, very stoic. That space between between your impression and your assent. Try to make that as long as possible.
That's a good way of
Um,
putting it.
Great. Thanks, Donald. Appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure. Cheers then. Bye bye.
Thanks, Donald. Thanks, all.
Bye, everyone.